Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Family Treehouse, a podcast series brought to you by Storied, where I chat with people that have a passion for genealogy, storytelling, or both. I am your host, Heather Haunert, and today I am very excited to chat with our guest, Dr. Sophie Kay. Sophie is a pro-genealogist and scientist from the UK, and one of my personal favorite things about Sophie is her Twitter and her hashtag occupation of the day. So welcome, Sophie. We're so excited to have you on today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Heather. Looking forward to a good chat.
Yes, me too. So why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you kind of got started in the field of, just family history in general.
Oh, I love that question because I think it's what has always amazed me and continues to amaze me. I think the more time I get to spend in this wonderful family history community is seeing the sort of diversity of backgrounds that people come to it from. I think we've each got our own path that brought us here. I think one thing that a lot of us have in common is, and certainly something for me, is I think a lot of us started asking questions early about our families. And so for me, that's where the germ of family history actually started. It was in those narratives, those stories that would be shared as oral history in my immediate family. And I think that piqued my interest from the age of about 6 or 7, and it encourages you to ask more questions. And so in an amateur sense, that's where my initial interest grew from. But then obviously in later years, it became something a lot more formal. I actually am a scientist originally. Professionally speaking, I'm a scientist by training. So I started off in mathematics and later biological sciences at the University of Oxford here in the UK. And it's actually when I was doing my doctorate at Oxford that I basically specialised in cancer research problems. And as part of my training for that, I trained in genetic extraction and analysis. So it is fabulous fun when you're already interested in family history to get put into a wet lab and you get to extract your own DNA and sequence it and analyze it. And I think that really, it allows that sort of original interest in family history that was a very narrative-based one to meld with the sciencey side of it. And I think it's really that moment that brought my career path to being a professional genealogist today.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I can't imagine how exciting that was for you to, get to do your own DNA. I think that's amazing.
Oh, absolutely. Because it's exciting enough when we get to, send a sample off to a testing company nowadays and get the results back. When you're actually looking at it, is one of the things I love about working with DNA is even when you've trained in it professionally and you understand how it works, it never ceases to amaze you. You always end up stepping back mentally a little and going, this is really beautiful stuff. It's absolutely incredible. So yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to work with it every single day, I think.
Yeah. And I love that you made the comment. I think every person that I get the chance to speak to, it's almost like we've all been bitten by that bug early on, as children and talking to parents or grandparents. I think everyone I've spoken to has had that bug early in chatting with people. So that's awesome. So Sophie, tell me about your occupation of the day. How did that kind of come about, and tell our audience a little bit about it?
Oh, so well, for people watching who haven't actually encountered it, so occupation of the day is a hashtag that I started on Twitter back in, it would have been, I think it was the 8th or 9th of September 2020. Okay. So that year when, we'd all been under lockdown, we'd been dealing with a pandemic, and I just, at that point, I think everyone was in need of a little bit of something to lighten the day. And really, as a result of that, I'd been interested in historical occupations for years, as part of my professional research and before then as part of my amateur family history. Because one of the things I've always felt is we can't look at our ancestors in isolation. We talk about storytelling for our ancestors, and really the concept of storytelling our ancestral narratives really requires us to not just be looking at the names and the dates that make up that family tree, but it's putting flesh on the bones. And for me, occupations really do that, because an occupation fundamentally anchors a person to the particular place they live in. If any kind of occupation persisted in a place for any amount of time, the product of that occupation or the service that it offers clearly has some sort of fundamental benefit or value to the community that it serves. So I think understanding those historical occupations is absolutely fascinating. And because, of course, we get that transition over time in our communities where there will be certain occupations that only existed for a very particular window of time, and then they get lost. And eventually, once our collective cultural memory has slipped away of what those jobs were, to us, it is really like stepping into a whole other world. And so you want to research your ancestors and understand their occupations, but often there will be really strange bits of terminology for the occupation that might come up and leave you thinking, oh, I don't even know what this is. If somebody's listed as a shoemaker, we've got enough knowledge to say, I might not know precisely what tools they were using, but I've got a good sense of what they were doing. But if you get an ancestor who's listed as a mush faker, most of us would be there thinking, well, what on earth is that? How can I even research this person or try and tell their story if I don't understand what this occupation is? So with the occupation of the day, the idea was to pique everyone's interest with one historical occupation every single day. It's sort of bite-sized history that allows people to take in interesting nuggets a little bit at a time. And I think what I've always tried to do with the hashtag is intermingle the familiar occupations that we can look at and say, oh, I know that, or I've got one in my family tree, with the ones that are far less familiar, and just give us a little moment of learning in the middle of the week.
Yeah, that's my favorite thing about it. Like I will get on and I'll look and it's the ones that are interesting that I'll think, I have no idea what that is. So, to be able to read and find out that's the fun for me.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. And actually, one of the things that some of my favorite historical occupations are ones that are not what you think they are. Because so often people will, we can all do it. We can fall into that trap of looking at an occupation and thinking, oh, yes, that's a familiar word. I know what that is. And not realizing that the usage of that term in a particular place and time is actually very different from what we might expect. So it's also a way of constantly surprising ourselves.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that even at my work, people are, we're around the water cooler on Slack having conversations about the occupation of the day. Somebody will bring one up. And so it's a great conversation piece. Getting people excited about family history. Sophie, why do you think just storytelling in general is such an important part of family history?
Oh, now we could talk for an hour just about that, I think.
Sure.
As I was saying a few minutes ago, I mean, the idea of the basic genealogy, the vital dates and the names, that gives us a basic family tree, but it doesn't really tell us much about who those people actually were. And what we're trying to do on that family history journey, I think, is to an extent reclaim some of those ancestral stories. And I think in the present day, one of the big, for me, one of the huge elements of value that family history stories hold is that way of binding families and communities together with a sense of handing down their collective story. And, I think a lot of us, when we research our family history, we're not going into it because we want to find highborn ancestors or somebody famous necessarily. We're doing it because for a lot of us, I think we want to gain an understanding of who we are and how we came to be the person that we are at this point in time. And that's not just the result of the decisions that we've made in our own life. It's the sort of wonderful snowball effect of the decisions that countless people made before us that have all ultimately fed into the person that we are in the here and now. And so being able to share those stories is really, really important. I think, whether it's a case of people who were raised by their birth families, being able to share the stories of their genetic forebears and their non-genetic forebears as well, whether it's sort of the step families as well, or whether it's a case of adoptees or foundlings seeking their own story through family history research and being able to then share that with their children. I think the story of the family has a huge role in us understanding our own identity.
Agree. That was so beautifully said. I think that it just helps us explain who we are and not just the here and now. Beautifully said, Sophie. How do you go about writing a story? So if you're going to write one of your family history stories, how do you go about doing that?
Now, first of all, one thing I would say is that writing up your family history is a really, really important bit of the journey. It's one that actually, in my own personal family history research, I always have to push myself to do, not because I don't want to do it. I end up so busy during my working day, working on researching other people's family history and writing those stories up. I very rarely get time to sort of sit with my own ancestors. So it's not something I get much time to do with my own family history, but it's such an important part of the process, because that's when you really get to check through your research as well. And for starters, make sure that the stories you're telling are genuine stories, not ones that are the result of errors. But once you're actually at that point of writing the story, I would always say, start from what you know. Establish the facts of the case as you have them with the historical evidence, because that historical evidence we use in our family history and the genetic evidence we have, if people have been bringing genetic genealogy into the process, the evidence is the sort of bedrock that we build the story on. And the next stage is making sure that instead of just the bare bones story, that's the names and the dates and some of the places, is making sure that we've got context. If somebody ever asked me, what do you think is the most important word in family history? I would say context, because that is what brings everything to life. It's what allows you to interpret the historical record appropriately. And it's what is really going to give you the good stories. So I would say, before you actually, run full pelt into writing up, try and explore the context of the time period and the place that you're researching. So one great, very accessible way to do that is newspapers. We get so caught up in family history with looking for named ancestors that it can be easy to forget that you can actually go to a sort of a period newspaper from your ancestors' time and place and say, this is a contemporary newspaper for them. How about I just read through this newspaper for all sorts of articles and see what was going on in that place at that particular time? So draw as much context as you can from newspapers, from street directories. And anyone who knows me well will also know I have an absolute obsessive love of historical maps. So before you write your story, map all the locations that you've got for your ancestors and see how that map is going to inform your story. And I think from there, you can really start to build something quite exciting. So something I would also advocate people do is to think about the sensory aspects of their ancestors' world when they're writing that story. So historical weather reports are a fantastic and I think very underused tool. You could find a little bit about the weather in local newspapers, but there are also dedicated sites that you can go to that may allow you to find out what the weather was doing on, the day that your ancestors got married. And just understanding little elements like that, when you're writing your story, it will really anchor you in the reality that your ancestors experienced. And it gets you asking a completely different set of questions about how they experienced that world at that particular point in time. And you can weave those sensory elements into your story, the sights, the sounds, the smells. Once you've done that contextual research into weather and the newspapers and all sorts of other wider reading, feed those details into your story. And that will create a really rich narrative about your ancestors.
I love the great tips with the street directories and the weather and newspapers. I think people get really short-sighted, and I'm thinking about newspapers in particular, but they will just hone in on that one article, that they're looking for that ancestor, and they totally ignore the rest of the newspaper.
Absolutely. And it gets us thinking about the sound and the physical experience, because when we're working with historical records, we are trying to assess how much we can trust that record and whether or not it's even about our ancestor in the first place. So when we're writing a story, we've got to force ourselves to step beyond that and say, use all five senses. How were those experienced by our ancestors at that particular point in time?
Yeah, great. I love those great tips. How would you say that you think, in what ways does storytelling help kind of bridge a generational gap, Sophie? So, a lot of buzz in the US for sure is trying to bring in that younger generation, and getting them interested in family history and genealogy in general. So how do you think storytelling can help kind of bridge that gap between that generation and an older generation?
Oh, I would agree. It's really, really powerful, actually. It's a very powerful tool for engaging young children. And the important thing is, I think, in that relationship is to talk to children as early as possible, even before they can, engage in conversation with you. You could even there be snuggling your baby or your grandchild or another baby that's somewhere else in the family and chat to them about the family history. You can't really start too young, because actually one thing which I hear an awful lot when I'm talking to clients and when I'm talking to other people elsewhere in our wonderful research community is people wish later on in life, when they look back, they always say, I wish I'd asked my grandparents or great-grandparents or other family elders, I wish I'd asked them this while they were still with us. And then there's that sense of loss and that sense of regret compounded by these stories that didn't get passed down. And so I would say you can never ever start too early. And I think we talked about handing stories down, the idea that there are certain stories in a family that may get passed down through multiple generations. As we all know, working with oral histories, it does mean we have to be careful, take things with, a pinch of salt and verify everything in our research. But at the same time, the idea of having that collective narrative handed down produces a very strong emotional bond in a family. And I think that is something that is largely independent of how old somebody is. We all love a good story. And I think most families have the sort of raconteur of the family that's the one that is particularly adept at bringing out these favorite family stories and retelling them time and time again to as good an audience as possible.
This is my favorite part of the show, is getting to ask everybody if they have a particular story, that a family story that they like to share, one that's been handed down. What is a favorite family story of yours?
Oh, no, actually, my favorite story from my family is actually, you have to go a little bit of a way back. You're not supposed to have favorite ancestors, so I'm not sure I should be referring to her as my favorite ancestor, but I think
I do.
We all know that feeling, don't we? So my great-great-great-grandmother, this one is my favorite story because actually it didn't end up being one that got passed down, sadly, because of someone in my family who died very, very young. There were certain family history stories from that side that completely stopped. They never got passed down. And so it's been my job as the family historian to reclaim those stories. So my great-great-great-grandmother, she's the ancestor I wish I could have met. She's a complete enigma to me because she was born in 1860. She was using the terminology of the time, the illegitimate daughter of a servant girl from Cheshire here in England. And based on those origins, very humble origins, you would not have expected her to make much of her life. She got married very, very young, and then she ended up in a relationship with her husband's business associate, which must have been quite a scandal at the time. And she ended up having a divorce from her first husband. Her first husband divorced her in about 1890. So that was very, very rare at the time. And she married that man, and he was her second husband. And I think we can only speculate, but it shows all the signs of very much being a love match. They stayed together for the rest of their lives, and her second husband was very successful in business. And by the time he died in the 1920s, adjusting for inflation, she basically ended up a millionairess.
Wow.
I will stress, none of this money ever came down my side of the family. But what I love about that story isn't the fact that she ended up super wealthy. It's the fact that going through her story, it seems such an improbable transit. We're so used to ancestors with those same beginnings as my great-great-great-grandmother, who wouldn't have had any chance of doing what she did. And so it's a very improbable story. And I checked and rechecked it time and again. And yes, it's definitely her. So she raises for me so many amazing questions about what kind of a woman was she to start where she did and end up where she did. And those ancestors, whether they did good things or bad things, because I always like to remember the fact that there is no such thing really as a good ancestor or a bad ancestor. People are capable of the entire spectrum of human experience in their decision making. We only see tiny little slivers of that over the course of our research. And so for me, my favorite ancestors are the ones that provoke the questions. And in the case of my great-great-great-grandmother, she provokes a lot of questions, which is why I think her story is a tremendous one.
That is an incredible story. I love it. And I love that you snuck in there the idea of, the love match. I think that, like you said, especially for that time frame, that, I think divorces always did happen, but it wasn't very much in the public eye. You know what I mean? Like you didn't see very much of it, but it did happen. So I think including those kinds of things, just it makes them more real. Like it happened then too. So great story. I love that story. Sophie, what are some tips or tricks or pieces of advice or wisdom that you could leave with our audience today on just getting started with storytelling and family history?
Gosh, there's so much I could say. Do you know what, actually, I would really love people to do more is to think about the mistakes they make and write those up as well. The mistakes that we make in our research, because most of our ancestral stories, when we write up our research, we only ever see the bits of people's research that worked out. And so we don't really have that chance to learn from each other's mistakes and say, oh, you got this wrong. And you've got these ancestors that are no longer your ancestors because they were actually the wrong ones that you got. I would love people to start being bold and writing up their research mistakes. Be very clear that it's stuff that went wrong and explain where you went wrong and why, because that's a way, sharing those stories in the community is a way for us to learn from each other. Absolutely. Once you've checked your research and you know that the stories you're writing up are the genuine ancestral stories, I would say give yourself time. Time is one of the things we often don't give to ourselves as genealogists because we get so excited at the find, so excited at the idea of writing up the story that we can rush through it. And I think the very best stories are the ones that we allow to sort of percolate through our mind over a period of time. And actually sometimes letting a story sit after you think you've written it, leave it for even like a week or two, even a few months if you need to, and come back to it and try and read it with fresh eyes and say, actually, is there, what questions is this provoking in me about the gaps in the narrative? Because I always think there's a method I developed a number of years ago that I call the negative space method for working with our ancestral narratives. And once you put it in perspective, you say, we know what they were doing on 10 days against a backdrop of thousands of days. How well do we really know that story? So I would always invite people when they're writing up as well, whether it's with a timeline or a padded spreadsheet, using my negative space method to interrogate those gaps where you don't have evidence and saying, what are the unknowns in that space, and acknowledge some of those unknowns in your story. I don't have a problem with when you write up, if there is a 15-year period where you have no idea what your ancestor was doing, confront that. Don't try and gloss over it. I would say be bold and confront it and say, actually, there's this period of time we don't know what they were doing. It could be for this reason, that reason, or the other reason. But for me, that's a more honest way of telling the story. We hold space in the narrative for the bits that we don't know.
Great. You have just been full of such great advice today. I love this. I'm excited for our listeners to hear this. Sophie, your passion for family history just shines through on your just whole being. So I love that. And I feel very honored that you spent time with me today. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's been great. Thank you.
So until next time, friends, embrace the power of your family's untold tales and embark on a journey of discovery. Let the ink flow and the words dance as you weave together the threads of your ancestors' lives. Start writing your family stories today and let their voices echo through the generations to come at storied.com. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Family Treehouse, where we celebrate the power of storytelling and preserving our family legacies. Storied is more than just a platform for sharing stories. Dive into those historical records and newspapers, discovering the hidden gems that bring your ancestors to life. Add branches to your family tree, connecting the dots between generations. Thank you for joining us on this storytelling journey. Your stories matter, and through Storied, they have the power to resonate across time and touch the hearts of generations to come. Keep uncovering your family's history and keep the spirit of storytelling alive with Storied.